Berlin, March 6, 1944. The morning sky over Berlin is a cold, steel-grey ocean. At 26,000 feet, the hum of engines drowns out the world below. 800 American bombers crawl across the horizon, a formation so vast it stretches from one cloud bank to another. Beneath them, the German capital braces for yet another daylight assault. But today, something is different. Above and around the bombers, sleek silver shapes glide in tight formation, their wings glinting like polished blades in the sun. They are faster, smoother, deadlier than anything the Luftwaffe has ever faced. From airfields outside Berlin, German pilots scramble into their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. Radios crackle with hurried orders. Abfangen! Intercept them before they reach the city. Engines roar. Propellers bite into the frigid air. Moments later, the first German fighters climb toward the bomber stream, and then freeze in disbelief. The escorts aren't falling back. They're climbing higher, faster, straight toward them. In seconds, the Mustangs close the distance. Guns blaze. Contrails twist into white scars. One Luftwaffe pilot shouts over the radio, voice cracking in shock. "They're outrunning us. Impossible, they're faster than our 190s. That day, the balance of the European sky was about to change forever. By late 1943, the air war over Europe had reached a brutal deadlock. The US 8th Air Force, flying from bases in England, was determined to cripple Germany's war machine through daylight precision bombing. Their heavy bombers, the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator, were powerful but slow. They carried their payloads deep into enemy territory, relying on tight formations and defensive guns to survive. But no formation could stop what waited for them beyond the Rhine. German radar operators tracked the bombers as they crossed the North Sea. Within minutes, squadrons of Bf-109s and Fw-190s scrambled from airfields stretching from Holland to Saxony. The Luftwaffe's interceptors, experienced and aggressive, dove straight into the American streams. Without long-range escorts, the bombers were defenseless once they went beyond the range of their P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings. Allied fighters could only accompany them partway, about 300 miles, before fuel forced them to turn back. After that, the bombers were alone. And the losses were catastrophic. Entire bomber groups vanished in single missions. On the infamous Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid of August 1943, 60 of 376 bombers never returned. Hundreds of men were killed or captured. Each plane lost meant 10 men gone, and another blow to the morale of those who climbed into the next mission. The U.S. Army Air Forces faced a grim truth. Daylight bombing over Germany could not continue without a true long-range escort. The strategy itself was at risk of collapse. American commanders, including General Ira Eaker and later Jimmy Doolittle, pressed aircraft designers for a solution. The problem wasn't firepower or courage, it was range. The bombers could go 1,500 miles. The fighters could barely manage half that. Factories across America raced to modify existing designs. Drop tanks were tested. Engine tuning was pushed to the limit. The P-47 gained auxiliary fuel tanks, and the twin-engine P-38 was stretched to its limits, but both were still heavy, less agile at high altitude, and limited by fuel consumption. Meanwhile, far from the front lines, a little-known American fighter was quietly evolving, one that would soon redefine the entire war in the air. The North American P-51 Mustang had started as a British request. In 1940, with Britain standing alone, the Royal Air Force asked North American Aviation to design a new fighter in record time. The result was a sleek, low-drag aircraft with a revolutionary laminar flow wing, efficient, fast, but at first powered by a mediocre Allison engine that performed poorly at high altitudes. It was a promising design trapped by the limits of its engine. Then came the breakthrough. In mid-1942, Rolls-Royce engineers in Britain fitted the Mustang's airframe with their Merlin 61 engine, the same power plant that gave the Spitfire its claws. The transformation was immediate. The new Mustang soared higher, climbed faster, and flew farther than anything of its class. When Packard began mass-producing the Merlin engine in the United States, the P-51B was born, a perfect fusion of British engineering and American manufacturing power. By late 1943, Mustangs began arriving in England. Their polished aluminum skins shimmered across the airfields of East Anglia. Pilots who first climbed into them understood at once this was different. The cockpit visibility was unmatched, the controls smooth, the endurance remarkable. Soon, a new phrase began circulating among bomber crews. The Mustangs are coming. It meant hope and survival. With auxiliary drop tanks, the P-51 could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The Luftwaffe's once safe interior skies were about to be violated for the first time. And as those silver fighters began to climb alongside the lumbering B-17s in formation, a quiet sense of inevitability filled the air, the feeling that a turning point was near. These stories aren't just history, they're proof of human courage and sacrifice. If you too salute these heroes, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and become a part of our journey. And don't forget to tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Let's continue the story. By the dawn of 1944, the Allied air strategy had entered a new phase, one designed not merely to bomb Germany's cities, but to annihilate its air force. The introduction of the P-51 Mustang made that ambition suddenly achievable. The 8th Air Force now possessed an escort that could fly 1,600 miles, dive like a hawk, and climb past 40,000 feet. It was agile at every altitude, something no other long-range fighter had ever managed. With the addition of two 75-gallon drop tanks under its wings, it could accompany bombers all the way from England to Berlin, Leipzig, or Munich, then fight its way home. To the men of the Luftwaffe, this new presence was both a tactical shock and a psychological wound. For years, German air defense had relied on one advantage: the short reach of Allied fighters. Once the American escorts turned back, German squadrons would swarm the unprotected bombers, striking from every angle until the skies were full of burning debris. But now, even over their own cities, German pilots looked up to see the glint of silver wings and black and white invasion stripes. The Mustang's Packard Merlin V1650 engine, a faithful reproduction of Rolls-Royce's legendary design, gave it unmatched performance above 20,000 feet. Its laminar flow wing reduced drag dramatically, allowing long, uninterrupted bursts of speed, a perfect combination for high-altitude escort. At 437 miles per hour, it could not only keep pace with the Luftwaffe's best, but often outclimb and outrun them. That speed, paired with endurance, changed everything. The Luftwaffe's defensive network had been built to counter bombers, not fighters that could range over Germany all day long. Radar stations began reporting fast, low contacts deep behind the front, Mustangs prowling the skies, strafing airfields, hunting fuel convoys, and ambushing fighters before they could even take off. For the first time, the hunters became the hunted. Inside the Reich Ministry, panic took hold. Field Marshal Erhard Milch and General Adolf Gorland, both veterans of the early Luftwaffe triumphs, recognized what was happening. The Luftwaffe was bleeding faster than it could recover. Germany's fuel production was crippled, training hours slashed, and new recruits sent into combat with barely 50 hours of flight experience. Against them stood the disciplined, well-supplied, and increasingly confident American pilots flying the P-51. The Americans began executing fighter sweeps, offensive patrols ahead of bomber formations. Instead of waiting to defend, Mustangs roamed freely, hunting Luftwaffe interceptors before they could reach the bombers. This tactic was devastating. Entire German squadrons were wiped out in the air or destroyed on the ground. By early March 1944, the Luftwaffe had lost its once unshakable grip on the skies. From Bremen to Berlin, the great cities of the Reich lay exposed to daylight bombardment. The myth of German air invincibility, born in the Blitzkrieg years and sustained by the daring of its fighter aces, was crumbling. Still, the Germans refused to yield. They gathered what remained of their elite units, Jagdgeschwader 11, 26, and 54, to protect the capital. Veterans like Gunther Rall and Walter Dahl prepared for what they knew would be a desperate struggle. If Berlin fell to daylight bombing, it would be a symbolic and strategic defeat from which the Luftwaffe might never recover. And so, as dawn broke over March 6, 1944, radar stations near Hanover and Magdeburg picked up the largest inbound bomber formation ever detected. More than 800 bombers, guarded by hundreds of P-51s, were heading straight for the heart of Germany. The order went out to every available fighter unit. Engines roared. Pilots sprinted across muddy fields toward their cockpits. But deep inside many of them was a quiet dread, for they knew the truth whispered across their squadrons in recent weeks. The Mustangs can go anywhere, and they can't be outrun. The stage was set for the most dramatic air battle ever fought over the Rhine. The technological angle, the perfect machine for the perfect moment. The P-51 Mustang was not born from luck. It was born from necessity, refined by science, and perfected by war. Every inch of its design reflected a single goal: efficiency in the air. Its signature feature, the laminar flow wing, was unlike any other in service at the time. Traditional wings generated lift by creating a pressure difference, but also induced turbulent drag, a constant drain on speed. The Mustang's wing kept airflow smooth and attached longer, dramatically reducing resistance. It allowed the aircraft to maintain high speeds with lower fuel consumption, the secret behind its 1,600-mile range. When paired with the Packard-built Merlin engine, this design reached its full potential. The supercharged V1650 engine gave consistent power above 25,000 feet, where most air battles were fought. Unlike the bulky Thunderbolt or twin-engined Lightning, the Mustang could turn sharply, dive fast, and recover quickly. For the first time, American pilots could match and surpass the agility of German fighters at every altitude. This advantage wasn't only mechanical, it was psychological. German pilots, long used to dictating the fight, now faced an enemy that could appear out of nowhere, above, below, or behind. Reports from Luftwaffe combat groups repeatedly noted a similar phrase in after-action debriefs. The enemy dove away at high speed. We could not follow. The Mustang was more than a fighter. It was a strategic weapon. Its presence over Germany made every airfield, convoy, and radar station vulnerable. By combining range, power, and precision, it turned Allied air strategy from defense into dominance. In engineering terms, it was a masterpiece. In wartime terms, it was a revolution. The human angle, life behind the canopy. From the ground, the P-51 looked graceful, a polished predator with wings that caught the morning light. But inside that cramped cockpit, life was anything but easy. Pilots of the 8th Air Force's fighter groups flew long, punishing missions, often 8 hours or more. The cold seeped through their gloves, the oxygen mask froze with condensation, and the constant engine vibration left their hands numb. Fatigue was their quiet enemy. Yet, for many, the Mustang was a dream come true. It was responsive, balanced, and forgiving. When they banked into a tight turn, it felt as if the aircraft anticipated their thoughts. Major George Preddy, one of America's top aces, described it simply. It's like strapping on wings. Escort duty demanded discipline. The fighter pilot's instinct was to chase kills, but orders were clear: stay with the bombers. Protect them. The mission was survival, not glory. Yet as confidence in the P-51 grew, pilots began to push further, intercepting German formations before they reached the bombers, breaking apart attacks before they formed. The Mustang pilots also carried the burden of seeing what the bombers endured. They watched helplessly as B-17s were torn apart by cannon fire or exploded mid-air. Many lost close friends from the bomber crews they escorted. The calm, cinematic beauty of those contrails at sunrise hid a daily reality of loss and exhaustion. Still, morale among Mustang squadrons soared higher than ever before. For the first time, they were winning, consistently, decisively, visibly. When the first P-51s reached full operational strength in early 1944, American bomber losses dropped dramatically. Every pilot in the 8th Air Force knew it. The Mustang had changed the odds. And within weeks, even the German aces, men who had once ruled the skies of Europe, began to realize that their era was ending. The enemy's perspective, from masters of the sky to the Outran. For nearly 5 years, Luftwaffe fighter pilots had been Europe's elite. From the lightning victories of 1939 and 1940 to the savage duels over France and Russia, they had lived by a code of mastery and confidence. German aircraft, the Bf 109 and later the Fw 190, were sleek, deadly, and built around the talents of men like Adolf Gorland, Gunther Rall, and Erich Hartmann. They were accustomed to choosing when and where to fight. But in 1944, that control vanished. When the Mustangs appeared, most Luftwaffe units initially assumed they were modified Thunderbolts or new Spitfires. But the reports kept coming: enemy fighter, silver finish, extremely high speed. Climbs better than the 190. Engages at will, then disappears. Even experienced German aces found themselves caught in deadly traps. The Mustang could dive faster than a 109 without losing control, a feat that stunned Luftwaffe veterans. Pilots who tried to disengage using a steep dive, a standard defensive maneuver, were often pursued and shot down before they could recover. In the words of a JG-26 veteran, it was as if the Americans had suddenly built a plane with no weakness. Morale began to collapse. For every German pilot shot down, replacements arrived with fewer flying hours and no combat experience. Meanwhile, the Americans rotated veterans through training programs, passing on hard-earned lessons. The Luftwaffe's margin of skill, once its greatest strength, was fading as fast as its fuel reserves. The Mustangs made even the heart of Germany feel small. Berlin, once a distant sanctuary, was now only hours away from Allied airfields. The psychological toll was immense. To many German pilots, it felt as if the war had flipped overnight, from dominance to survival. The tactical and strategic angle, turning air war into air supremacy. By early 1944, the US 8th Air Force had adopted a new philosophy: destroy the Luftwaffe first, win the war second. The Mustang was the tool that made this doctrine possible. Before, escort fighters had been chained to the bombers, forced to fly slow and tight. But the P-51's range and performance gave commanders new flexibility. Under General Jimmy Doolittle, fighter groups were authorized to roam ahead of the bomber stream, to engage, disrupt, and annihilate German interceptors before they reached the bombers. This was a radical shift. The escort mission transformed into a full-scale offensive. Squadrons of Mustangs would sweep 50 to 100 miles ahead of the bomber formations, hunting Luftwaffe fighters as they scrambled to intercept. Those who took off too late were destroyed on the climb. Those who waited on the ground were strafed in their hangars. The results were devastating. Within weeks, the Luftwaffe's coordinated defense system fractured. Airfields from Hanover to Brunswick were reduced to smoldering wrecks. Experienced German leaders, Gorland, Trautloft, and Steinhoff, pleaded with high command for tactical reforms, but Hitler insisted that all efforts remain defensive. Meanwhile, the Allies expanded the air offensive into Big Week, Operation Argument, in February 1944. For 7 days, bombers struck aircraft factories, and Mustangs swept the skies clean of opposition. The Luftwaffe lost hundreds of aircraft and irreplaceable pilots. By March, the once mighty air force that had terrorized Europe was a shadow of itself. Fuel shortages grounded squadrons. Mechanics stripped wrecked planes for spare parts. Strategically, the Mustangs achieved what no bomber or bomb could: the destruction of Germany's air power from within. By the time the Allies prepared for D-Day, they controlled the air so completely that no German aircraft could approach the invasion beaches in daylight. The air war over Europe had been decided long before the tanks rolled across France, and its outcome was forged in the clear, frozen skies above Berlin. March 6, 1944, the first daylight raid on Berlin. Before dawn, engines thundered across England's frozen airfields. The order had gone out at 3 a.m. Berlin would be bombed in daylight. It was a decision loaded with both strategy and symbolism. Berlin was not just a city. It was the beating heart of the Third Reich, the seat of Hitler's power, the symbol of German invincibility. To strike it openly, in daylight, would signal that the Allies had conquered the skies. But to reach Berlin, the bombers had to cross 620 miles of hostile airspace, a corridor defended by radar stations, flak batteries, and hundreds of Luftwaffe interceptors. At 8 a.m., the first waves of B-17 flying fortresses lifted off from their bases in East Anglia. One after another, they climbed into formation, over 800 bombers, escorted by nearly 100 P-51 Mustangs and hundreds more P-47s and P-38s. The formations stretched for miles, a living procession of aluminum and firepower. German radar stations near Bremen caught the signal first. Alarms blared across northern Germany. Fighters of Jagdgeschwader 11 and JG-26 scrambled into the frigid morning air. Their mission was clear: stop the bombers before they reached the capital. As they climbed, the Luftwaffe pilots saw something unexpected: thin contrails forming above and ahead of the bomber stream. The escorts weren't turning back. The Mustangs were still there, and closing fast. The duel begins. Over Hanover, the two forces collided. The sky erupted into chaos, a dance of smoke, metal, and flame. German Fw-190s dived head-on toward the bomber boxes, their 20mm cannons flashing in bursts of orange light. In response, the Mustangs peeled away from formation, banking into intercept courses so tight they seemed impossible. Captain Donald Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group described it later. It was like watching a door slam shut on the Luftwaffe. Every time they tried to form up, we were already there. One by one, German fighters fell, their dives intercepted, their turns mirrored. The Luftwaffe pilots, desperate to break away, discovered that even their best escape maneuver, the high-speed dive, no longer guaranteed survival. The P-51s followed effortlessly, gaining speed instead of losing it. Radio chatter filled the Luftwaffe frequencies. Achtung, they're on me, they're still climbing. Can't shake them, I'm hit, I'm hit. The German formations broke apart under relentless pressure. Some pilots bailed out. Others tried to ram bombers or lure Mustangs into ground fire. But the sheer coordination of the American escort shattered their rhythm. By the time the bombers reached Berlin, much of the Luftwaffe defense was in disarray. Berlin under the bombs. At 11:30 a.m., the lead formation of B-17s reached the outskirts of Berlin. The city lay beneath a blanket of haze and smoke, its factories and rail yards already targeted. Then the bomb bay doors opened. Thousands of pounds of explosives tumbled toward the capital, striking railway depots, aircraft assembly plants, and oil storage tanks. Berliners fled into shelters as anti-aircraft guns roared from rooftops. For the first time in the war, the Nazi capital was bombed in broad daylight. And above it all, the Mustangs circled like sentinels, holding back what remained of the Luftwaffe. In the chaos, German ace Oberleutnant Wilhelm Moritz led a group of Fw-190s into a desperate interception attempt. His men dived through the flak, straight toward the bombers, only to find themselves swarmed by Mustangs within seconds. Moritz escaped with his life but lost half his squadron in minutes. He later admitted, "They were everywhere. It was as if the Americans had learned to fly faster than thought." The turning point becomes reality. When the formations finally turned westward toward England, the Luftwaffe had failed to stop them. Out of more than 800 bombers, only a fraction were lost. For the German defense network, it was a humiliation unlike any before. At airfields outside Berlin, commanders watched as smoke rose over the city. The realization was unavoidable. Germany's airspace, once impregnable, was now penetrated at will. That night, American crews returned to their bases exhausted, frostbitten, but victorious. They had done the impossible, flown to Berlin and back in daylight. For the Luftwaffe, something far greater had been lost than aircraft or pilots. It was the end of the illusion that Germany could defend itself from the air. And though the fight would continue, every German pilot who took off in the months that followed did so under the shadow of that day, when the P-51 Mustang proved it could outrun, outfight, and outlast them all. The shock of March 6, 1944, rippled through every level of the Luftwaffe command. What the German people saw that day, contrails above Berlin, bombers unbroken, Mustangs chasing defenders through their own airspace, was more than a defeat. It was the unraveling of a myth, the belief that Germany's skies belonged to Germany. Within days, Allied intelligence confirmed the scale of the victory. German fighter losses had reached catastrophic levels, more than 160 aircraft destroyed or crippled in a single day. Dozens of veteran pilots were gone. But this was only the beginning. Operation Argument, Big Week. 2 weeks earlier, the Allies had launched Operation Argument, a massive coordinated air offensive designed to cripple the German aircraft industry. Between February the 20th and 25th, 1944, the skies over Leipzig, Augsburg, Stuttgart, and Regensburg became the stage for the largest aerial battles in history. Factories producing the Bf 109 and Fw-190 were the main targets. If the Allies could destroy them, the Luftwaffe would be unable to replace its losses. Before the P-51, such an operation would have been suicide. But now, the bombers had full-range escorts, Mustangs sweeping far ahead and above, turning every attempted interception into a slaughter. Captain Clarence Bud Anderson of the 357th Fighter Group remembered, "We didn't just escort the bombers, we hunted the hunters." Over 7 days of relentless combat, the Luftwaffe lost over 600 aircraft and hundreds of its most experienced pilots. The Allied losses, though heavy, were sustainable. For Germany, they were not. After Big Week, General Gorland admitted privately that the Luftwaffe was bleeding to death. Training schools could no longer produce replacements fast enough, and new recruits, some barely 20 years old, were being thrown into battles they could not survive. The Luftwaffe's veteran aces fought bravely, but they were vastly outnumbered. Each new Mustang group arriving in England tipped the balance further. By spring 1944, the Americans had achieved what once seemed impossible: air superiority deep inside enemy territory. The new hunt. With the Luftwaffe in retreat, the nature of the air war changed. The P-51s were no longer just defenders, they became predators. Mustang squadrons began conducting fighter sweeps without bombers, scouring the skies and striking airfields across Germany and occupied Europe. At dawn, German mechanics would push their fighters onto runways, only to hear the distant roar of incoming Mustangs. At 400 miles per hour, they would arrive out of nowhere, machine guns blazing, leaving rows of burning aircraft in their wake. Fuel depots, convoys, and railway lines were shredded. Even in the air, the German aces who tried to resist found themselves cornered. The Mustang could outclimb a Bf-109G and outdive an Fw-190A, the two backbone fighters of the Luftwaffe. Its pilots could fight on their own terms, at any altitude, in any weather. Oberst-Lieutenant Walter Dahl, one of Germany's leading aces, described the futility. They stayed above us, always with the sun behind them. They could choose when to attack and when to vanish. We had no answer. The collapse. As spring turned to summer, the Luftwaffe's operational strength disintegrated. By May 1944, some fighter wings could field only a handful of serviceable aircraft. Fuel shortages crippled flight training. In desperation, Germany began developing jet fighters, the revolutionary Me-262, but production delays and Hitler's interference meant they arrived far too late to change the war. In contrast, the P-51 was everywhere. By June 1944, nearly 1,500 Mustangs operated from English and Italian bases, patrolling from the North Sea to the Alps. They cleared the skies for the D-Day landings, ensuring that when Allied troops stormed Normandy's beaches, not a single German aircraft could intervene effectively. In the following months, as Allied armies advanced through France, the P-51s became the long arm of air power. They strafed retreating columns, shredded supply trains, and eliminated what little air resistance remained. The German Fighter Command, once the pride of the Reich, now existed only on paper. Of the tens of thousands of fighter pilots trained since 1939, only a few hundred remained active by late 1944. The decisive blow had been struck not by sheer numbers, but by superior design, coordination, and endurance, all embodied in the Mustang. The final realization. When the first P-51s crossed into German airspace months earlier, many German pilots dismissed them as another Allied experiment. But by the end of 1944, they knew the truth. Every Luftwaffe ace, from Gorland to Hartmann, had faced the Mustang, and nearly all agreed it was the finest piston-engine fighter of the war. In after-action reports, one repeated line appeared across multiple units. Enemy aircraft, type unknown, cannot be caught. It was the admission of defeat. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, had been outflown, outbuilt, and outlasted. And high above the ruins of Europe, the silver wings of the P-51 Mustang gleamed like symbols of a new age, an age when speed, range, and precision decided the fate of nations. By the summer of 1944, the air war over Europe was no longer a contest, it was a rout. For 5 long years, the Luftwaffe had defined the rhythm of battle. From Warsaw to Dunkirk, from Crete to Stalingrad, it had reigned supreme. But now, the once-invincible force was exhausted, its fighter wings shattered, its pilots depleted, its fuel reserves nearly gone. And above the ruins of that empire flew the silver silhouette that had broken its back, the P-51 Mustang. Berlin burns, but the bombers survive. Every new raid over Germany told the same story. In late May 1944, 1,300 bombers, escorted by hundreds of Mustangs, penetrated to the very heart of the Reich. Over Berlin, over Leipzig, over Brunswick, the Luftwaffe rose to meet them with everything it had left. The result was carnage. The Americans lost only a fraction of their bombers. The Luftwaffe lost hundreds more irreplaceable fighters. From that moment on, Germany's industrial heart was naked to Allied air power. By the time summer came, the Mustang had achieved what Allied leaders once thought impossible: daylight air supremacy over Europe. Factories were leveled, fuel plants destroyed, and transportation networks paralyzed. The skies that had once echoed with the howl of German engines were now ruled by the deep, confident roar of the Packard Merlin. The death of the Luftwaffe. Inside Germany, despair set in. Veteran pilots, the heroes of 1940 and 1941, were gone, many lost in hopeless defensive actions against overwhelming odds. Their replacements were young boys, barely trained, thrust into the cockpit of a Messerschmitt with only a few hours of flight experience. They took off in scattered groups, often without radio coordination, climbing straight into swarms of Mustangs. Most never returned. By autumn, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Fuel shortages meant that even surviving squadrons could rarely train or scramble. Airfields across the Reich were littered with wrecks, some destroyed in combat, others bombed on the ground before they could take off. It was the slow death of an air force that had once terrified Europe. General Dwight D. Eisenhower later wrote that the Mustang's arrival had altered the complexion of the air war completely. It wasn't just about the machine, it was what it enabled: unbroken bombing campaigns, relentless pressure on German industry, and an Allied advance that never again had to fear the Luftwaffe shadow. The power of range. The genius of the P-51 was not only in its speed or agility, but in its range. With drop tanks slung beneath its wings, the Mustang could escort bombers from England to Berlin, even as far as Vienna or Ploietti, and back again. No other Allied fighter could do that in 1944. That single advantage transformed strategy. No longer were bomber formations forced to turn back at the edge of safety, leaving German fighters to swarm over them unopposed. The Mustangs stayed with them, fought above them, and cleared the skies all the way to the target and home again. To the bomber crews, those sleek escorts became a lifeline. Many remembered looking out from the glass noses of their B-17s or B-24s, seeing the silver fighters sliding into formation, and feeling, for the first time, safe over Germany. One airman later recalled, "When you saw the Mustangs, you knew you were going to make it home." The psychological shift. For the Allies, this dominance brought confidence. For Germany, it brought dread. By late 1944, even civilians in Berlin could recognize the sound of a Mustang's engine. They would look up, see the flash of sunlight on polished aluminum, and know that no one could stop them. Every daylight raid, every strafing run, every Mustang that swept low over a railway yard or fuel depot was a reminder: the Reich was defenseless. The Luftwaffe still existed in name, but its wings had been clipped. A symbol of the new air age. The P-51's triumph was not just a tactical victory, it was a symbol of a larger truth. The age of air power had fully arrived. Wars would no longer be won only on the ground, but from the skies. Control the air, and the rest would follow. By the time American and British troops crossed the Rhine in early 1945, German resistance in the air was scattered and desperate. The last Luftwaffe sorties were flown by a handful of jets and piston fighters that could do little more than die bravely. Above them, the Mustangs continued to range freely, as they always had, watchful, silent, and unstoppable. The legend was sealed. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the skies over Europe told the story more clearly than any headline could. Where once squadrons of Messerschmitts had ruled, now only the silver wings of the P-51 Mustang remained, unchallenged, untouchable, and immortal. The aircraft that had entered the war as an underdog had ended it as the undisputed master of the air. A new standard for the world. In the immediate post-war years, air forces around the globe studied the Mustang as if it were a textbook. Its balance of speed, range, firepower, and maneuverability became the benchmark by which every fighter thereafter would be measured. Engineers from Britain to Japan, from Russia to the United States, analyzed its aerodynamic profile, the laminar flow wing, the engine integration, the control harmony. Many of the jet-age designs that followed, including the early Sabres and MiGs, borrowed lessons first proven by the P-51 over Europe. Even the Germans, whose Me-262 jet had briefly promised a future beyond propellers, admitted the Mustang represented perfection in piston engine design. Kurt Tank, designer of the Fw-190, later called it the finest long-range fighter of the war. From warhorse to peacekeeper. Though the war had ended, the P-51's service did not. In Korea, just 5 years later, Mustangs once again took to the air, strafing convoys, supporting ground troops, and proving that even in the dawn of the jet age, their design still mattered. Renamed the F-51, they carried the same grace and authority as before. Pilots who had grown up hearing of the Mustang's legend now flew them themselves, keeping alive a legacy born in the skies above Berlin. But in many ways, the Mustang's greatest contribution wasn't in combat. It was in doctrine, the realization that technology, endurance, and design could change the very geometry of war. Every modern multi-role fighter, from the F-4 Phantom to the F-22 Raptor, carries that same DNA, a machine built not just for speed or firepower, but for reach. A symbol of courage and mastery. To the men who flew them, the Mustang was more than an aircraft. It was a partner, one that forgave mistakes, responded like thought, and carried them home when everything else failed. Many veterans would later describe the feeling of flying it as something close to poetry. When the Merlin engine roared to life and the world blurred beneath its wings, they felt the full meaning of air superiority, not as a concept, but as an experience. For the German pilots who faced it, the feeling was very different, or mixed with disbelief. They had once believed themselves to be the finest aviators in the world. The day the P-51 arrived, that belief died in the smoke over Berlin. End of an era, beginning of another. By the end of 1945, hundreds of Mustangs were parked on airfields across Europe and the Pacific. Some were scrapped. Others were sold to Allied nations or kept in service as trainers. A few were lovingly preserved by their pilots, who couldn't bear to part with them. But their spirit lived on. Every time a modern pilot throttles up before takeoff, they owe something, however small, to that elegant, powerful silhouette that first taught the world what true air dominance meant. Because when the P-51 Mustang appeared, the sky itself changed. It marked the moment when human engineering, courage, and vision converged, when air warfare became not just a tactic, but a decisive art. And in that transformation, one truth was written forever across the clouds. Speed, endurance, and will can turn the tide of history. In the final winter of the war, the skies over Europe told a quiet truth, a truth that had cost thousands of lives and countless machines to reveal. Power in war no longer rested on fortresses, or tanks, or even armies. It rested in the air, in the thin blue space where speed met courage. The P-51 Mustang was not just another aircraft. It was a statement of what happens when engineering brilliance, industrial might, and human determination align perfectly. It gave the Allies more than victory. It gave them freedom of movement, the ability to strike at will, and to see their enemy's capital burn in daylight. It shattered the myth of German invincibility, and in doing so, announced the arrival of a new world, one ruled not by the size of nations, but by the reach of their wings. For the pilots who flew it, the Mustang was a living companion, loyal, responsive, and fierce. For the bombers it protected, it was salvation. And for the Luftwaffe, it was the ghost they could never outrun. When historians look back at 1944, they see more than battles and losses. They see the moment humanity learned that the sky itself could decide the fate of nations. Berlin's fall began long before the Red Army reached its streets. It began when the first Mustangs crossed the Rhine, flying farther, faster, and higher than any had thought possible. In that moment, the war's balance shifted forever. And when the smoke cleared, one machine stood as the embodiment of that change, sleek, silver, and silent on its return to base. The P-51 Mustang did not just win a war. It redefined what victory meant. Because from that point onward, every soldier, every nation, and every dream of dominance would first have to earn the sky.